Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are going to be completing our Flutter Node.js user authentication application. So without wasting much of the time, let's dive into the project and let's make things happen. So just make sure you go to your folder where you create like your Flutter projects, and then just make sure you create a new Flutter project. Okay, so after you do that, just make sure that you open the project with your favorite text editor, right? So I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. So yeah, so let's get started. Okay. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we install a couple of packages, right? Because we are going to be using a couple of packages. So I'm just going to copy them and then I'm just going to paste them into a flutter pubsec.yaml file, right? So inside the pubsec.yaml file, just make sure that under the Cupertino icons, just make sure that you paste these packages, right? We have the HTTP package that we are going to use to make requests to API. We have the JSON annotation, and then we have the freezed package that we are going to use to create our model classes. We also have the fp.dat, and then we have the Flutter secure storage. So you need, if you remember the last time when we created our API or Node.js API, if you remember from the previous video, if you have not watched that video, please make sure that you go back. I've put the link in the description below. So from that video, you can see that we created this. When a user signs into application, right, we get this user token, right? So we need to secure this user token. We need to make sure that when you store it in our device, we need to make sure that it's secure, right? So that's why we use the Flutter secure storage. And then there are other couple of packages that we need. We also need these packages. I'm just going to copy them and then I'm just going to paste them. I'm just going to paste them below this Flutter links package, right? So we have these packages. We have the build runner, we have the JSON serializable, and then we have the Flutter River. We also have Flutter Riverport, because we are going to be using the Riverport as our state management package. So just remove it and then make sure that it's under the Flutter secure storage package, right? So without wasting much of the time, let's go into our lib folder, right? So inside our lib folder, we need to make sure that we create a couple of folders. We need the config folder. We need the config folder. We also need the repository folder. We also need the repository folder. We also need the models folder, because we are going to have a model, and then we also need our controllers folder, right? We also need our controllers folder, and then we also need the other folder that we need the providers folder, right? So, and then we need the utils folder for utilities, and then we also need a views folder for screens, right? Okay, so inside our config folder, what we need here, we need to create a file called appconfig.dat. So this file is going to contain our configurations for making requests to our API. So I'm just going to call it appconfig like this. app config, right, like this. So we are going to have Android base URL. So you need to know that when we're working with Postman, right? If I go back to Postman here, you can see that our address is usually localhost 4000. But when you are working with emulators, be it iOS simulator and Android emulators, this doesn't work, right? So we need to replace this with for Android. We need to replace this with 10.2.10.0.2.2, like this, right? So this is for Android, right? So it's supposed to be a constant because it's not going to change. So it's static constant. And then for iOS, I'm just going to call it static constant base URL, like this. So for iOS, it's 127.0.0.0.0.1 and then semicolon 4000, like this. Okay, so and then we have our couple of routes that we are going to work with. We have the register URL. So this is going to be /API /register user, like this. And then the same goes for the login URL. So I'm just going to copy this and then I'm just going to paste it below. And then I'm going to change this to register URL, and then I'm going to change it to from register user to login user, right? This is supposed to be login URL, like this. Okay, so now the next step is let's move into our repository, right? So inside our repository, I'm going to create a new file called the local repository. Local repository.dat. So it's a class local repository. So this local repository is going to be responsible for storing our user ID and also the user token, right, inside our device. So what we need is we need Flutter secure storage package, right? Flutter secure storage package, and then we also we need to call it. It's supposed to be local auth repository, like this. Okay, let's just name it local repository. So now let's create a constructor for a class. So local repository, and then we need the required Flutter secure storage. Flutter secure storage. And then what we need to do is we need to set _Flutter secure storage to Flutter secure storage, like this, right? So once we are done with this, the next thing that we need to do, we need to create a method code that's going to check if our user is logged in, right? It's going to be a future of type string, which can be nullable, and then we're going to name it is logged in. And it's also an async method, right? So what we are going to do is going to return await flutter secure storage dot read. So the way that flutter secure storage stores data is it stores data into key value pairs. If you are familiar with maps, it also works in a similar way. It stores in key value pairs. So we use a key to retrieve like the data. So in our case, the key is going to be user token, right? So what this method is just simply doing is to make sure that if the user is logged in, right, make sure that if the user is logged in, then we can retrieve the user token that the user got when they logged into our API, right? And then the next method is to store the token. So what we want to do is, if you still remember from a Postman, right? If I go back to Postman, right? If you still remember from our body, right? We have this email and then we have the password, right? So if the user logs in, we get this user token. So what we want to do is we make sure that when the user logs in, we need to store this token so that we can use it in the future to make sure that the user can access certain types of routes in our application, right? So we are just going to store a token which is of type of string, right? Access token, which is an async. It's an async function, right? And then what we are going to do is we are just going to await flutter secure storage, right, dot write. So what this write does is we are just going to store this token. We are just going to store this token inside our what? Inside our flutter secure storage, and then the value of the token is going to be access token. So that's the value. So what's happening here is we have this key, and then we have this value which is the access token. And if you remember from our previous method, we just use this key to retrieve this user token, right? All right, so the other thing is we also need to store the user ID, right? So if I go back to our Postman, you can see that we do not only get the access token, right? We do not only get the user token, but we also get the ID, which is the user ID. So we want to make sure that we store that ID inside our Flutter secure storage, right? Store user ID, which is going to also be a string of type user ID. It's an async function, and then we're going to just await Flutter secure storage, right? Dot write. We are going to write user ID, and then the value is going to be user ID. Okay. Now, what we need to do is we also create another method for also reading that user ID, right? It's going to be a string. It's going to be also, it can be nullable. Read user ID, which we are going to use to read our user ID from the Flutter secure storage, right? So this Flutter secure storage packet, it stores these values locally inside the device, but these values will also be encrypted, right? then we are going to use the read, and then we are going to use the key, which is user ID, right? And then we are going to convert that to a string, right? Like this. And then the other thing is we need to create another function to log out the user, right? This function is going to be logout. It takes in a build context. And then async, it's going to be an async function. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that when the user logs out from our application, we need to make sure that we delete both the user ID and the user token, right? And then we're going to use navigator dot push named, which the route is going to be sign in screen. I'll create these routes later on. Sign in screen, like this. Okay, so now we are done with the local repository. So what are we doing in the local repository class? What we are doing in the local repository class is we're initializing the Flutter secure storage packet, and then we make sure that we set this Flutter secure storage object to our constructor. We make sure that we attach it to the constructor, and then we create this method for retrieving the user token, which is called is logged in. And then we use the user token key to retrieve the user token that is stored locally in our device, right? And then the next method that we created is the store token, that's going to store our token inside our device locally, right? And then the key is going to be the user token, and then the value is going to be the access token, right? And then also do the same thing for storing the user ID, and also for reading the user ID, right? So once we are done with these methods, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the auth repository, right? So the auth repository is going to be involved for making sure that it's going to sign in our user or register our user in our API. So it's going to be auth repository dot that, like this. So let's create the class auth repository. So what this class needs is it's going to take in final http dot client from our HTTP package. We're going to set it to _client, right? And then let's just take this import here, as you can see, from the Flutter package HTTP package as HTTP. And then the next thing is we also need the local repository _local repository, like this, right? So we make sure that we create a constructor for the local repository, constructor for our local repository, like this. And then we need to make sure that we attach the HTTP, the client object, to the one in our constructor, the same with the local repository, right? So required http dot client, and then we also need the local repository, which is local repository. like this. Okay, and then we make sure that we set the client to the client, and then the local repository to the local repository, like this, right? So now that we are done, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the method for logging our user, right? So it's going to be future, and then that future is going to be of, we are going to have type either, the type either, and then we are going to have two states. We are going to have a state whereby if the app fail, if there is any failure, we are just going to show that failure to the user, the reason why the connection to the API fails. And then if it's successful, we are going to return the user model. So that's what happens with the either. The either, it takes in left or right. As you can see, it's a suit class that takes in left or right. So we usually use the left side to represent failure, and then the right side to represent if there's any success in the connection to our API. As you know, connection to the API, there are either two states. It's either there is a failure or there is a success. So I hope that makes it clear. So what we need to do is we need to create this app failure, this class, the app failure class, right? So if you go inside, we need to create this app failure class. Let's go inside our utils. It's going to be app failure.dat. So I'm just going to paste in the class. This is the class which is going to represent the message that we are getting from the failure. And then we have a constructor, and then we will simply convert this message that we got as a failure to string, right? Something like this, okay? So now let's import app failure here. Let's import it, and then the user model. Let's go inside our models, class, and then let's create the user model, right? So let's create a user model.dat, like this. So with the user model, what we need to do is we need to create an abstract class user model with underscore $ user model, like this. Okay, so we also need to make sure that we create a constructor, factory user model, and then inside the constructor we have a string which is going to be ID. We also have a string username. We also have the first name. Also have last name. And then we also have user token. Okay, which is equal to underscore user model. So we need to make sure that we annotate this with at freezed, and then we also need to make sure that we use this part user model dot freezed dot dat, and we also need to make sure that we have part user model .g.dat. So this is going to generate for us the user model classes, right? So, okay, so I forgot, we should import the phrased package, right? We should import the phrased annotation package, because if we don't, it won't work. So let's import it there. Let's just put the import statement, and then let's try to regenerate it again. So here it's supposed to be user model, okay? And then I forgot, we need also another method, factory user model. User model from JSON. It's going to take in map string dynamic, and then it's going to return a JSON, and then we need underscore $sign user model. User model from JSON, and then we are going to just set it to JSON. And then let's also run the flutter pub run build command to generate these classes. As you can see, now we have our user model classes. You can see now we have these two generated classes. Okay, so yeah, let's just close them, and then let's continue with the authrepository. So here I'm just going to import this user model, right? So now what we need to do is we are going to create a method called login with email and password. Login with email and password is going to take in the email, and then it's going to also take in the password. And then it's going to be an async. It's going to be an async function, right? So what do we need here? We also need to create some headers, right? Map string, and then string like this. Request headers. We need to create request headers, which is equal to we are just going to set the accept to application /JSON, and then we are also going to set the content type. We are going also to set the content type to application /JSON. Okay, so now we need to create the URL. So the URL is going to be URI.http. URI.http. So the URL is going to be appconfig.base URL, right? And then appconfig dot login URL, like this, right? And then we need also to get the response that we are going to get from the server, right? So the response, this response is going to be equal to await client dot post. And then to make a post request, what do we need? We need the URL to our API, right? Which is the one that we created above here. This with the base URL and then the other URL to the login URL, right? And then what else do we need? We also need headers, right? So the headers are going to be equal to the request headers that we created here, right? Like this. And then what else do we need? We also need to get a body, right? So the body is going to be json.encode. Since we are sending this data as a post request, we need to encode it, right? So we need to set the email. The email, we are going to set it to email, right? And then we have the password that we are going to send to our API, which we are going to set also to the password, right? Like this. And then we need also to get the data, right? So the data from the server. So the data from the server, which we are going to say, the data that we are going to get from our server is going to be json.decode. So we are going to decode any responses that we are going to receive from our server, which is equal to response so here it's supposed to be response, right? Like this. So it's going to be response.body, like this. Okay. And then there are some couple of things that we need to do here. We need to make a try catch block. Since this is a network request, we need to make sure that we create a try catch block in case if there are any errors that we need to catch, right? So create a try catch block like this, right? So inside our try catch block, what we are going to do is we need to make sure that if the response that we are getting from server, if the response.status code that we are getting from server is equals to 200, or the response, or if our status code is equal to 201, that means that it's successful, right? Then we'll make sure that if it's successful, then what we'll do is we'll make sure that we'll use the local auth repository, and then we'll store the user ID. So this user ID that we are going to store we are going to get it from the data object. Remember that the data object that we created, is going to just decode the JSON that we are going to get if the user logged in. For example, let's say if like this, what this data object is going to do is it's going to return all this data here. So that data is the one that we are going to use to store it inside our local repository, right? So we are going to store user ID, which is of type data, and then underscore ID. That's the user ID, right? Underscore ID, like this, right? So if we go inside our user repository to retrieve the user ID, we need to make sure that the key is underscore ID, like this, underscore ID. right? And then what else do we need to store inside our local repository? We need to make sure that inside our local repository also store the token, right? Which is, if we go inside our JSON response, this is the user token. This value is the one that we are supposed to store. So let's go back and then let's just create the user token like this, right? And then we are just going to return right. So if you still remember, I said that the either returns a left or right, and then I said the right is the one that we are going to use if there is a success. So from our method, you can see that the right, either we have left or right, and then the right, the success, that's the one that we want to return the user model. So if it's a success, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to say user model dot from JSON, and then from JSON, what do we need to put? And then we just need to put in the data that we are getting from JSON. So what does this data contain? So this data is just going to contain all this information right here, right? Okay, so what about if we don't get this 200? So if we don't get the status code 200 or 201, what we are just going to do is we're just going to return left, right? And then we are just going to return up failure. And then up failure, the message is going to be data message like this. For example, let's say let's go back to Postman. Let me just go back to Postman, right? So let me just make sure that I put a wrong password, right? Something like this. Or let me make sure that we put an email, wrong email, right? Like this. You can see user not found. So this if the status code, as you can see, we got a status code of 400. So if we get a status code of 400, what is just going to display inside our application? It's just going to show us that user is not found, right? And then on the catch method, if we catch an error, we also need to just return left. We also need to return up failure like this, and then e.toString like this, right? We need to place in e.toString like this, right? So that's it for our login method, and then the same goes on for our sign in with email and password, right? So with our sign in with email and password, I'm just going to copy this method, login with email and password. Let's just copy it, right? Let me just copy it and let me just paste it below like this. So now what we need to do here is we need to make sure that we change this to register with email and password. Register with email and password, and we need to make sure that we have the user ID, the username, because the username is also required when creating a new account. We have the username, right? And then the username, let's put it inside our JSON encode. Username, and then username like this, right? And then if response.status code is equals to 200, we don't need to store these tokens because we don't have the token. And then we'll just return this, right? This data. And then if there is an error, we are just going to display it as a message So it's almost basically the same. The only difference is that on login, that's when we will store the user's token, right? So that's it with our auth repository. So what we need to do now is we need to make sure that we create auth repository provider. Final auth repository provider is equal to provider, like this is equal to provider, and then let's make sure that we import flutter report. So let's make sure that we import flutter report provider, and then this provider is going to return auth repository. But for auth repository, we need the client, and we also need the local repository. So for the client, what we are going to do is, let's go inside our provider class, right? Our providers folder. Let's go inside our providers folder, and then let's create a file called providers.dat. So here, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create a final HTTP provider is equals to provider, like this. Then we have reference, and then the reference, we are just going to return http dot client, like this. So let's make sure that we just bring the import statement for HTTP package, like this. Okay. So now if I go back, I'll just go here. I'll just say for the client, I'm just going to say reference.watch. So we need to make sure that we have a reference object here. And then reference.watch. And then we need to watch the HTTP provider, right? And then for the local repository, we also need to create a provider for the local repository. So this provider is going to be final local repository provider. This goes to provider. Then we need a reference which we are going to point out to local repository, like this. And then we also need Flutter secure storage. So let's go back inside our providers, and then let's create a provider for the final Flutter secure storage provider. Flutter secure storage provider is equals to provider. And then reference, and then let's set it to Flutter secure storage. Flutter secure storage, like this. Okay, and then let's go back, and then reference.watch Flutter secure storage provider, right? Okay, so let's just make sure that we import Flutter report, like this. And then this is supposed to be Flutter secure storage provider, like this. So there must be an error. Flutter secure storage provider is equals to flutter secure storage. Okay. Okay, it's supposed to be, you must not set it direct. It's supposed to be reference.watch and then flutter secure storage provider, like this. And then if we go back here, we are supposed to watch the local repository provider, right? Like this. So that's it for the auth repository. So in the next section, we need to move on to controllers, and we need to also move on to creating like the user interface for applications. Okay, so let's move on to the controllers folder, right? So inside the controllers folder, what we need to do is we need to create the auth controller file. So I'm going to create a class called authcontroller. This class is going to extend async notify, right? This class is going to extend async notifier, and it's also going to take in user model as our state, right? So let's make sure that we import flutter report, and also let's make sure that we import the user model. So the other thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we initialize the auth repository. And also need to make sure that we initialize the local auth repository. Local repository, which is equal to local repository, right? So when we use the async notifier now, as compared to state notifier, if you used to watch my previous videos with the report, we used to use the state notifier, but with the async notifier now, we no longer need to create an auth controller constructor. What we need to do is we need to create a build function, right? So the first thing is we must make sure that we override it at first. And then we create the user model. And then we set the auth repository equal to reference.watch auth repository provider, right? And we also need to set the local auth repository to local auth repository provider, like this, right? And then the next thing that we need to do is we just return null, right? And then, so let's just make sure we put an exclamation mark. So now what we need to do is we need to create a function of type future, and then of type void, because this function doesn't need to return anything. So this function, I'm just going to call it login with email and password. And then we need to check in the email, and then I also need to check in the password. And then a boot context. So let's make sure that we import the build context. All right, now that we are done, what we need to make sure is we create a variable user, and then we are going to set it to await. And then we must set it to authrepository dot login user with email and password, like this. And then what we need to do is we need to make sure that we create another variable that we are just going to call val, and then we create a switch statement. This switch statement is going to take in the user variable, right, that we created. So if there's an error, which we talked about, we are going to display it with the left. So let's import fp.dat package, right? So the value, and then final L, and then we are going to set that to, we are going to just show a snack bar, show snack bar. Okay. So let's go into our utils folder, right? Inside our utils folder, let's create a snack bar .dat. So I'm just going to paste it in this this method. It's a method for displaying a snack bar. Text in a build context and the text, and then we are going to use scaffold messenger, and then it's going to display as a snack bar, right? So let's just import the snack bar here. And then we need to provide the context first, and then l.message. We need to display l.toString, right, like this. Okay. And then we need also for the right side, the value for the right side, which is going to be final R. And then if it's a success, then we need to just navigate to the home page. Push navigator.push named, and then we're just going to navigate to the home screen. And then let's import. So there must be a semicolon, right? And then let's put a semicolon here. So this is the method for the sign-in method, and then let's do the same for the register method. Let's just copy this. It's almost the same. Let's paste it below, and then let's change it to register with email and password. Register with email and password, and then we need a username here. Username, and then let's change this to register with email and password. Register with email and password, and then password, and then let's just put in the username, right, like this. Okay. So if it's successful, we need to redirect the user to the login screen. All right, so now we are done with the user controller, right? We are done with the user controller. Now we need to create the authcontroller provider, right? So let's create the authcontroller provider. Which is equal to async notifier async notifier provider. It's going to take in the authcontroller, and then user model. And then you need to set it to authcontroller.new like this. Okay, now we are done with the authcontroller. Now we need to move on to creating the user interface, the login, and also the register its screen, right? Okay, so now we move on to our views, right? So for our views, we need to create the sign-in screen inside our views folder, right? We need to create a sign-in screen.dat, and I will also need to create a register screen.dat like this. All right, so it's going to be a stateful widget, sign in screen, right? So what we need to do is we need to create a few variables, right? We need to create the email, and then we set it to empty, and then we also need to create the password. Okay, so we also need to create another Boolean function, which is async call process, and then by default it must be to false. All right, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a global key for forms, right? It's going to track the form state, right? Global key form key, we just go to global key. All right, like this, right? And then the next thing we need to validate the forms, that make sure that if the user enters like empty data, we need to also make sure that we alert them, right? So I'm just going to create a variable called form, which we are going to set to the form key dot current state, so the current state of the form. And then we are going to check if the form, right, if it's a valid, right? Dot validate so we need to make sure that we set this to form state, right? Okay, right, now we got rid of that error. So if form.validate, right, what we need to do is we just need to save the form state, right? Right, here we go, and then we are just going to return true. Else we are just going to return false. All right, so inside here we just need to return a scaffold. We just need to return a scaffold widget, and then we need a body, then it's going to be safe area, and then the child is going to be a single child scroll view, single child scroll view, and then child is going to be a column widget, and then children. And then what we need to do here is that we need the spacing from the top, right? So the spacing is going to be size box. I'll give it a height of 120, like this. Okay. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a form. And then for the form, we need to give it a key. And then if you still remember, our key is that form key that we created, right? And then we also need a padding. So it's going to be edge inserts dot all. Let's just give it a value of 8, and then the child of the padding widget is going to be a text form field. So it's going to be a text form field. Enable suggestions. We are going to just set it to true. Then the other thing is a keyboard input type. So we need a text input type dot email. Because this is going to be the user's email, right? Email address, like this. The next thing is onChanged. So what this onChanged method is, make sure that it tracks the values that the user enters, right? So we are going to make sure that we set the email, that variable that we created, to the value that the user enters, right? And then we need to decorate this text for the input decoration, right? Border, and then outline input border, right? And then the border radius is equals to border radius dot circular. Give it a border radius of 10. And then we also need the hint text. And then we also need a border. Outline input border. And then we also need the hint text, which is going to be enter your email. Then I'll also need to style the hint, which is going to be text style. Let's give it a color of black. The black. And then we also need a prefix icon. Which is icons.email. And then the icon, let's give it a color of black, which is colors, the black, like this, right? And then let's give it an alignment with the int. Let's just give it a true, right? And then we also need the validator. The validator is the one that we use to validate the data that the user enters, right? It takes in a value, the value that the user enters, right? I made a mistake. And then it takes in a value like this, and then we just check if the value dot is empty, right? If the value is empty, or if the value if it does not contain the @ symbol, right? If it does not contain the @ symbol, what we just need to do is just going to say return invalid email address, like this, right? Otherwise, we're just going to return now. So that's it for the email text form field, and then we need the spacing between these two. So I'm just going to use the sized box. The sized box. Let's give it a height of 12, right? Like this. So we have the form padding. You need to make sure that it's after the padding, right? So let's just make sure we get rid of the so we must make sure that this column, it must start with the okay. So here I made a mistake. This column, we must remove this column. So let's wrap this inside the column widget, right? And then let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this column. Let's come here and then let's get rid of this column widget here. Then let's copy this here, let's cut it, then let's just paste it below this one, right? And then let's go here on top of this column, let's just put a size box give it a height of 120. Okay. So now that we have pasted the other one below here, we need to change it to password. So what did I write here? It's password. It's supposed to be underscore password. So let's set the password is equals to value, and then let's change the text input type to visible password, right? Enter your password like this, and then let's change this to password. If the value is empty, then we are just going to say enter password. Then I think everything here is okay. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need a text. We need to separate this. So we just have constant. Let's give it let's use a sized box, and then let's use a height of 15. And then what we are going to do under is text don't have an account. And then we're just going to say register. And then let's give it a style of text, style, color, colors dot black, and then font size is 20. And then we need a font weight also. Then it's supposed to be font weight dot bold like this. Okay. And then we need to make sure that it's at the center, right? So we use a center widget. Then we also need to make sure that we repeat with the gesture detector. And then we make sure that on tap, when the user taps in the text, we are just going to navigate into navigator dot push named. And then we are just going to direct the user to the register screen. Okay, I'll create these routes later after dealing with these. Okay, now that we're done, another thing after this, now we need a button. So this button, I'm going to just wrap it inside the sized box. We give it a height of 300, and then I'll also give it a width. The width is supposed to be 300, and then the height is supposed to be 50, right? And then the child here is going to be the elevated button like this, and then on pressed it's just going to, and then the text here, the text is going to be sign in. And then what we're just going to do here is, so since we're using Riverpod to consume providers, we need to make sure that we're using consumer stateful widget, and then we change this to consumer state. Consumer state, and also make sure that you change this to consumer state, right? So let's import flutter Riverpod package. Let's go back to our button. We're going to do is ref.read. So I make sure that if you're using Riverpod, consuming Riverpod provided inside button, just make sure that you use the read, right? And then the notifier. dot login with email and password. So we are going to set that to email dot trim, and then to password dot trim. Okay, so let's do it like this, and then let's just make sure that our code is formatted, and then let's just make sure I use this constant value. Right, for the register screen, what I'm just going to do is, this is one and the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this, and then I'll go inside our register screen. I'm just going to paste this, and then I'm going to just changing this to register screen, and then let's change this to register screen. Let's come here, and then let's also change this to register screen. Register screen, and then let's come here, and then let's change it to register screen, like this. Okay, so now that everything is done, we are left with the username underscore username, which is equal to username, like this, right? And then let's just make sure we copy this one, and then let's copy it, and then in between let's put a size box, and let's put a height of 12, and then below let's just paste this, and then let's change that to enter your username, and then let's change this to username, and then let's change it to text input.text, like this. So let's just remove this. Yeah, let's change it to enter your username, like this. Okay, and then let's change the icon to person. All right, okay, and then let's also make sure there's some spacing here. Sized box height, this was 12. Then all right, now that we're done with the let's go to the here it's supposed to be login. Let's change it to login screen, like this. And then let's just change it to already have an account. Already have an account, and then login, like this. Right, and then let's change this to register with email and password, and then let's just set this to email.trim, username.trim, and then password.trim. Okay, so that now we are done with the register screen and the sign-in screen. Now we need to take care of our routes inside our main.dat file. So inside our main.dat file, what we need to do, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a widget, right? And then I'm just going to call it default home, which is equal to the sign-in screen, right, like this. And then inside our main function, what we need to do is we just need to use the widget flutter binding dot ensure initialized, like this. And then the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a container for our providers, right, which is equal to provider container, like this. So if you have not heard about provider container, a provider container is just an object that stores the state of providers and allows us to override other provider behaviors. So all the providers that we have, we can store them inside our provider container, right? And then I'm just going to create another variable called result. So this result is equal to await. So let's just make sure this function is async. It goes to await container dot read. So we are going to read a provider, which is the local repository provider dot is logged in. So if you remember, is logged in is going to give us the user token, right? So if result is not equal to null, so if you remember, if a user logs in, right, we get a user token. So if that result, that means if that user token is not equal to null, what we need to do is we are just going to set the default home that we created, right? This default home to the home screen. So basically what happens is that inside our Flutter secure storage, right, inside our local repository, if we have that user token, then we are just going to redirect the user to the home screen. If we don't, then the user is redirected to the login screen because they don't have the user token, which they must have if they are logged in, right? So let's just make sure this is the home screen. Okay, so let's just import the home screen. All right, now, and then let's just put a constant. And then for our run app, right, what we need to do is we need to use uncontrolled provider scope, which takes in our container, which is the local repository provider, and then its child is going to be our my app, right? That's its child. Then make sure that it's a constant, right? Like this. Okay, and then the next thing that we need to take care of are the routes, right? So we need to make sure that for the routes, we need to make sure that we get rid of this home, right? And then we also need to get rid of this we also need to make sure that we get rid of this theme, right? Like this. So for our routes, we need to make sure that it's going to be the default route, right, is going to be our home. It's going to be home screen, right? And then the next, we need to make sure that we have the home screen. Going to check in a context, and then this must direct us to the home screen. And then we also need to make sure that we have the register screen. Which will also take us to the register screen. And then if we go into our authcontroller, we use the login, if I'm not mistaken, we use the home screen, right? And we also need a route for home screen, right? Sorry, we need a route for login screen. So it's going to be login screen, and then context, and then login screen. Let's just set to a sign-in screen like this. All right. So now we are done with our application. So let's just run it, and let's see the results on our emulator, right? So there must be something wrong with so let's go into home screen. Let's make sure this is scaffold, and then the body, center, and then child, text, and then let's just call it home. Okay, and then let's see. So somehow it's taking us direct to the home page. I don't know why. Let's check into our routes. No, this is a typo. This was supposed to be default home. It was supposed to be default home like this. So if we reload this now, so let's try to run it again. Let's see. So I think there must be a typo somewhere. Home screen is goes to home screen. Default home is goes to sign in screen. Without the default home. Okay, supposed to be is logged in, and then let's see. All right, somehow there must be a typo somewhere. Okay, so line.ensure initialized provider flutter final containers goes to provide a container and control provider scope. then okay. Okay, so I don't know why it keeps us, because it must take us to the sign-in screen, right? Since we don't have this, since we have not logged in, it must take us to the sign-in screen. So let me check. Maybe let's try to reinstall to remove the app and try again. Or we can try another emulator, I think. Okay, somehow it takes us to the home page. I don't know where I'm making this error. There must be an error somewhere. So let me check where I'm going wrong. Okay, so let me check where I'm going wrong. Okay, so we're back. So I just found out that the typo was because we didn't have this await keyword here. That's why it was taking us directly to the home page. But now if I reload, you can see now we now have this page. If we don't have an account, let's try and create an new account. You show me, so let's say 500 at gmail.com, and let me just put my username here, so then let's say 500 also, and then let's just put a password. It's saying users not found. So I think the problem might be that if we go to our register screen, right, register with email and password. So let's go to the authcontroller here, and then register with email and password. Okay, let me try to see what's going on the backend side, right? It's saying that user not found. Okay, so let's go back and then let's change these to register, right? Let's change this to register. Okay, so let's change this to register. Right, then we have email m.trim.password. Let's say 600 at Gmail. Okay, I think I know where the problem is. If we go into our auth repository, right? Inside our auth repository, inside this register with email, we're supposed to change this URL to register URL, right? So just make sure you go back and make sure that you correct that mistake. That's why we're getting that error, right? So now if I say show nesu 500 at gmail.com, and then my username is going to be show nesu 500, right? And then let's do 1 2 3 4 5 6, right? And then let's register. You can see that now we are redirected to our login page because now we are now registered, right? And then 500 at gmail.com, and then 1 2 3 4 5 6, right? As you can see, now it takes us to our home page. Now we are fully authenticated, right? Even now we're fully authenticated. Even like on our home screen, what I need to do here on the center here, inside this, I'm just going to change this to child. Inside this child, I'm going to put an elevated button, right? On pressed, I'm just going to, and then I'm just going to use the text of logout, right? Like this, right? So let's remove this constant here. That's why you're getting this here, right? So what I'm just going to say, I'm going to say reference. So yeah, let's use the consumer widget. Consumer widget. And then here, let's just pass in the widget reference. And then here I'm just going to reference.watch. We're just going to watch the local repository provider. No, inside the button we need to use the read, right? Dot logout. So we need to log out, right? Something like this. So if I reload the application, if I click the logout button, it's not logging us out. Let's check what's going on with this sign in screen. It's supposed to be login screen, right? If we go back now, you can see that we have been automatically logged out because it deleted all our user token, and then here we have changed it to login screen. So let me just log in and show you for the last time. No, it was supposed to be 500 here, and then 1 2 3 4 5 6, right? And then you can see we are logged in. Now we are logged out, right? So basically that was it, guys, on user auth with Firebase and Node.js, right? So in the next videos we are going to be creating like code operations with Flutter and Node.js. Thanks for watching, guys.